talk is truth. Yeah, truth is not a fact. Okay, I'm glad that's over with. So these are concepts, and of course, philosophy is all kinds of relativism about this. This is true, and there can't be an absolute truth, and otherwise it would be a relative truth, and so on and so forth. So, but what I think could be looked at by anyone who is a meditator, who is working on their consciousness, who is trying to understand, get to know themselves, trying to see what is going on in our mind, moment by moment, what is happening as we get up in the morning. Notice the disagreement with what's happening. Notice the agreement with some things. Warm blankets are good. Having to go to work depends on the job, I guess. If you want to go there now. There's always some kind of shifting back and forth. So when I say truth is not a fact, if it were factual, then it would have its opposite, and then it would also be something that would come and go, like relative things do. So this has been talked about in all philosophy, every place, and I'm not a philosopher, so, or am I a scholar, so I don't particularly study that. If I did, I'd forget what I just read. On the other hand, and on the same hand, relative truth is whatever is true has its opposite, and that's how we know about it, is because of the contrast, the comparison. And we are, in our minds, are always looking for something we can lock down on, hang our hat on, believe in, and so on, in order to, as it looks over here, to secure our identity, to stabilize ourselves so that we know who we are, and we know what we believe, and we know what we're here for, and we know what everything is about. And of course, there's lots of ways of approaching that. Buddhism is a way. It is a spiritual path. There are other kinds of spiritual path, the theistic path, that would posit some kind of a higher power or a supreme being, and then uses that as a reference point, which is, of course, maybe you wouldn't say of course, but I'm saying that, of course, is a fabrication of various minds. And quite often it's about trying to control people rather than fundamentally helping them. Right. So when we sit down and face the wall, when we look and watch our thoughts come and go, we notice that the ones that are the feelings, the thoughts, and so on that are believable, if they have a strong emotional atmosphere or quality to them, whether positive, negative, neutral, you can actually have neutral feelings. So the idea in our tradition, in our way of working with our minds, is to see what is true ourselves, not just subscribe to something and then coax ourselves into believing this, not believing that, and so on. Any questions?
What is a fact?
It's a concept about something.
What's the difference between fact and truth?
Well, a fact is something we think is true, and something is true doesn't need our support. So it's something we believe about something.
How do we experience truth differently than we experience facts?
I don't know. What do you think? How's it look to you?
There's facts that can go to our problems. logical, clear causal, relationship. Maybe the truth of something that I might think I know my gut.
Okay. So we're all working with that kind of situation all the time. We think things in our life, some things are motivate us because we believe in them. We think they're true. And those dynamics can help us fundamentally. Can also get us into trouble. Can get us cause us to do more spinning around and more searching for some kind of reference point. It's very hard to, without getting building up some propaganda or something, to encourage people to just do what we do in our sitting meditation. Just sit down and endeavor to see what it is rather than create some kind of a state based on one's preconceptions that you should be peaceful or you should be you need to somehow, that when I say train the mind, I'm saying train the mind so that you're in a little cage or so that you're on a leash or so that you have control. Training the mind from this point of view is more about training the mind, training to see the constant positionality that we all take for and against, for and against. Any kind of emotional dynamic that comes up, if you've been working with your mind and training your mind, then there's a possibility there's some breathing room around that before you decide what that is, before you label that as true or not true, or that's happening because of this. Quite often what we do is when something arises, we, instead of just being with whatever's arising, we might be threatened or encouraged by whatever that is, and then we make it into something else rather than letting it be exactly what it is. Not incorrect, it's just that it causes more circularity. So when you sit down and face the wall, sit down, hold still, face the wall, face the floor, however your meditation practice, face your insides of your eyelids, whatever that may be. Just observe. And when you just observe, when that really comes to what you could call fruition, you won't see much. You might not see anything. You might not see anything else, capital E, else. It's a difficult thing to talk about, to convey, to talk about some kind of absolute understanding, because that absolute understanding coming from this way of looking at our minds is not separate. So if it's really truth, if it's not separate, then you can't see it. Yes?
Training the mind in words brings up a sense of action, but really we're not doing anything.
It's kind of the other way around. We're seeing how much we're finding everything we can to hold still. So we're holding our body still, taking this posture, this very symmetrical posture, and we're observing the way the mind just keeps tumbling and tumbling and tumbling, as it was doing maybe 10 minutes before we sat down. It was on the move, going this way, going that. I like it. I know I need to do this. I need to do that. I'll get to that later. A constant comment that's going on all the time about everything. I'm not saying you don't have flashes or periods or gaps where you're not doing. Might not even know what you're going to do next. There could be some kind of spaciousness, but usually that's contrasted with all the rest of it, so it looks like a special event. So training the mind, the idea is to sit down, hold very still, and through contrast, watch what continues to move. This is basically shikantaza, or observing. And then the training part is to watch what is moving without doing anything with it, without adding to it, without subtracting or dividing or doing any math at all. And just observe what that is until you see what that is. So it's all patience. Gary.
So is there
say something, doing something. I'm a little confused when something arises and you go, oh, there it is. But that,
No, wait. Oh, there it is extra.
right, that's what he said.
Right is extra. Keep going. Do you follow? I'm not particularly picking on you trying to do that, but I'm just saying that we tend to ignore the space, and one of the ways we ignore the space is to throw something in it. So you would sit down, and the ego mind sits down and will come to the conclusion, possibly, that this is boring, which is probably accurate, and I'm not getting anywhere. That's very true. Yes.
No, I'm saying
Yeah, me. So we need to give her a gold star. She's not getting anywhere. Rushi.
Is observing, I'm going back. Sorry, maybe I'm leaning on it.
Don't apologize. Go ahead.
So Buddha nature is already here. It's not something we have to do anything for. So is it really observing, or is there a sense of just nothing?
You might see a kind of nothing possible. There might be like just an instantaneous appraisal of what was there, and it might be nothing. But that's extra. Because it's a concept about something else. So it's still not, as to use the classical word, it's still not samadhi, or not separate. It's not actually living in the no separation. To live in the no separation, you won't see anything. There will not even be a seer.
To live in the no separation, you're not observing.
No, that's over with. That's the path. To observe is the path. The ground, path, and fruition are threefold logic is you're suffering, or you are somebody's suffering, and rather than go to drugs or doctors or psychiatrists or therapists or jog every day for 3 hours. And I'm not mocking someone who's doing any of that. They should. I don't want people to suffer. If that's the only thing that they can do, then they should do that. Or they could. I wouldn't object. I wouldn't say, well, they're wrong. They should be meditating. No, they should do what they need to do. But if they come in here and sit down as you're doing here, then this tells me you want to hear something. And I'm sorry that, not actually sorry, but I could say, I would be polite. I could say, I'm really sorry I'm not more entertaining. No. Go ahead.
The meditation instruction that Sokuzan read today said, don't strengthen your mind, strengthen your awareness.
That's something I said.
When we're observing, how are we not strengthening our mind?
So what's being pointed out there, or endeavoring to point out, is the thinking process. Don't strengthen the thinking process necessarily. So the kind of invisible muscle that we're looking at is a muscle that just is relaxed and just present. Just the ability to we're not saying if we say let go of everything, then there's too much self-centeredness involved in that. So I don't say, even though I might think when I'm looking at someone who's dearly hanging on to some kind of idea, concept, and is driving themselves crazy with it, I might want to say, relax, let go of that. You're fixated on that, don't do that. But I also know that that's not helpful to them because they have to see they're hanging on. So for me to go like that, probably not going to work. But to sit down and just observe is not a strengthening so much in the conventional sense that we think of thinking about and processing and analyzing and using logic on things, even though logic plays into it, like threefold logic of the ground, path, and fruition of we're suffering. We need a path to work, a way to work with that. That's in our situation is meditation, and the fruition is realization. And what do you realize? There's nothing to struggle with. But that because the consciousness and the mind and human beings are so complicated, extremely. When I say complicated, it's like it's always going to be an understatement. There's so many little bits and pieces and particles. In Buddhism, it's called, in ancient times, it was called the 10,000 things. Probably a few more than that. It's countless. Numbers of things that are moving through apparent space and time to create any given situation of, joy, Sokuzan or Rushin, or any person, myself, someone who's here is brought into this time, into this situation by all kinds of relative truths bouncing on, off and on each other, so till we get here. So to strengthen the mind would be to just watch that. So you can't see who you are. You can if you look for someone, you won't be able to find anyone. You have to really look a lot, because otherwise you'll always impute or think, I'm here, of course. Who else is tasting the peanut butter? Got to be somebody. And actually, it's like not like there isn't any taste of peanut butter, but taste is just tasting itself. There's no other, to use relative truth and describe it. There's really no other way to do it with a modicum of accuracy. If you say someone is tasting something else, we're going back to the original division or split that we grasp at, and we tend to. Sometimes it gets so magnified that it ends up being two countries that are threatening each other instead of two neighbors over the back fence, or two people who are in the same family, which so often we see that, and it's heartbreaking to see that. People who are really, really close by blood and yet are intensely at war with each other. So the strengthening part that I was referring to, as far as I know, I don't remember who said that, but that part would be, don't necessarily strengthen the figuring out part, like the body posture in the East for I have to figure something out is this or this. The body posture in the West is the thinker. Was it Rodin's? The thinker. Gosh, I gotta figure this out. What is going on? So we go in and we try to analyze it and use logic. We ask our friends and we listen to their opinions, and we agree with some of it and not with others. And it isn't there isn't some kind of understanding. We probably wouldn't even get to this situation. Provisional teachings of train the mind wouldn't get here unless we'd done a lot of figuring that was kind of dead ends. So the training seems to come from, over a period of time, slowly giving up the territory of the thinking mind, slowly, and not doing something deliberate like pushing on it, because that's more passion, aggression, and ignorance, but something through just watching the way it has its claws into everything. If you just look at that, you bring your awareness to that, you don't have to let go. It just lets go. If you see really intense struggle right in front of you, you don't have to have an agenda about it. It just won't continue. It has to be seen very closely. And that, to ego, that's embarrassing, because an ego wants to blame itself, because then it gets to have a little bit longer life. Wants to blame someone else, which also it gets to be the blamer who knows who else is wrong. And it's not that, this is the hard part, it's not that somebody didn't actually cause some harm. Some person didn't harm you or do something to you that was disrespectful. Out of their own confusion, trying to get what they want, desire, get their hopes and wishes fulfilled, they've hurt you, maybe deliberately, feeling they should get their way, or maybe mistakenly because they weren't clear about what they were doing, or all wrapped it up in their own situation. But to see that there's no actual self is difficult, because there is a relative situation going on where there is a victim and a what do they call the person? Huh? Yeah, perfect. And there is that. It's just that deeply in any given situation, you go down deeply into it, we start to find that you can't actually find someone who's to blame. You can't find one person who is like the prime cause of anything. Anyone who is doing something, there's all kinds of causes and conditions behind that situation. And of course, the ego mind tends to go in and say, well, they need to take responsibility. Well, the one who is functioning there, the body-mind complex consciousness, that's the person who may or may not need to do that. For someone else to tell them that, misunderstanding. It's disrespectful to tell anyone what to do. It's actually disrespectful in some ways to give advice when someone hasn't opened up and said, I need your help. If they do that, then even then you need to look closely at whether they just want to be a person who asks for help, which is a sneaky form of ego, and also a way of hiding out. If you feel like somebody's getting too close to you, and they might have an idea how insane you are or how self-deceptive you are, they'll start to ask for your help, because that immediately stops the investigation, someone else's investigation into you. Have you noticed? I'm not picking on you, but yeah, I am. You work with people all the time, so you have people in front of you, just like at the Temple of Senshu, who's working with people every day, sitting down and talking to people who are wound up in knots over their thoughts and their ideas and their judgments about themselves and about others. It's painful. So we're training the mind to relax. We're just artificially, you could say, we're sitting down and we're taking this position, and this is the Buddha. We're not talking about some historical guy 2,500 years ago. We're also not ignoring that situation, but sitting down, holding very still, so the body is already there. This is when the body mind stop separating, and the body mind are no longer separate. Then this is wisdom, albeit a physical form. But it's not separate from it anymore. So it's and it won't know that it's lies. More?
So is the awareness body and mind?
The thinking process, the mind, and everything are separating all the time. It's just like the obvious example is you're driving down the road, thinking about what you should have brought with you, or you're thinking about where you're going. You're kind of seeing the traffic because you're not going to run into anything, but you're really, most of your thinking process is somewhere else, separated out. And when this realization non-occurs, which it doesn't actually occur, it non-occurs. When that non-occurs, your mind won't be anywhere but here. The body mind are no longer separate. It may be happy, it may not be, but it won't be somewhere else. Yeah, what's that one? Look at that. That's a Netflix ad, yes.
So I think you just said if you may be happy, you may not be,
Yeah.
but you don't want to be anywhere else.
You can't be anywhere else. There isn't anywhere else but here.
So would there even be a comment on I'm happy, I'm not happy?
Probably not. But you would notice it, but you wouldn't necessarily describe it. You wouldn't lock in on it and, put it in a bin with a label on it, spoons, forks, knives, happy, unhappy.
So with that, would there be no launching into wanting something else then?
Yeah, you wouldn't mind being unhappy. Thank you.
How would you even know if you're unhappy?
Huh?
How would you even know?
Well, you wouldn't.
It seems that happy and unhappy are labels too.
They are.
So is it we check out our body mind situation and then declare that it's happy or unhappy?
I think a self-centered ego mind, or someone who believes that there's somebody separate from everyone else, would do that. But wisdom doesn't shut down on anything. So therefore, it may be happy, it may not be happy, but it's not looking for something else. As long as there's a physical form in this situation, as long as we're here, we're breathing oxygen and being pulled down to the earth by gravity towards the center of this big ball of dirt, then all kinds of relative things are coming and going and coming and going. But the wisdom mind is like a sky. It doesn't agree with or disagree with clouds, but it doesn't. It's aware that they're there. Just to use that metaphor a little further, it knows about them. I mean, it'd be a pretty dumb sky that didn't know there were clouds there. Sorry. I really apologize. Help me here, word cloud. You're the wordsmith. Help me. Say something about this.
What would you like help with?
Exactly. Thank you. No, I did. That's the right person. Further questions? Yes. Sokuzan.
When the mind wanders and it's wandering, where is the awareness?
If you know your mind is wandering, then it's.
If you don't know your mind is wandering,
Well, then you couldn't ask the question.
is there awareness when the mind is wandering?
If you're aware that you're wandering,
If you're not aware that you're
then
wandering,
there's no wandering.
Then there's no wandering.
There's only wandering if there's someplace else. And if nothing is if nothing is separate, then there isn't anywhere else.
does awareness come from?
Yeah. The path quality of it, the including and seeing that you're including your life. You're sitting and you're whatever's arising. You could say you're including it. You're not at war with it. You're not particularly accepting it or validating it, but you're not excluding it. So you could say that you're including it, just like we include everything in this room without actively including each individual thing. We just include the situation. Go ahead.
If someone is sitting and their mind is wandering and we're looking at them, could you say that that meditator has no awareness?
You mean if you kind of knew their mind was wandering? Like you could kind of.
It could be me. It could be me.
Huh?
It could be me.
Yeah, like if I was looking at you and I would go, wait a minute.
I'm just trying to understand awareness and wondering if there's a meditator that has awareness and one that doesn't. Is that possible?
What?
Is it possible that one person is sitting and has no awareness, and one is sitting and has more awareness?
Yes.
Is it possible to have no awareness?
Yes.
The effort, okay, so effort, right effort, does right effort involve growing awareness?
I think so. I think there's a kind of a development where over time one is less. There's not even a time. There's not like increments. Oh, you're getting closer. You're getting closer. Oh, there's more and more. There's more and more. There's less and less disturbance. There's more and more harmony or equilibrium or equanimity or however. That's true, but one is not particularly looking at that, and one is you could say transcendentally dyslexic about it. You know, we know things are happening, but we're not particularly picking and choosing anything. This doesn't mean that we're schizophrenic, because that's where there's actually we're being terrorized by our own lack of understanding and our own hope and fear, and we keep shuffling into opposites in order to have different personalities. But one who is at rest, which is what this is, just at rest. There isn't anything else. And if there is, even that's nothing else. And if a whole bunch of things happen, even that doesn't indicate anything. Doesn't point to anything beyond itself. As long as you're looking for something else. It says this on the back of her Roxu in 2010 when I gave her Jukai. I wrote nothing else. Of course, that was something else, wasn't it? If someone had been standing there, could have said, liar. You said there was nothing else, and then you went and wrote about it. If I started smiling, would that make sense? Smiling for me. Okay, let's get down to business.
Does it take effort to endeavor to observe without adding, subtracting, or ignoring?
Paraphrase yourself.
Does it take the intention to observe without adding, subtracting, or ignoring?
Yes, it does.
So what's the difference? Is there a difference between willpower and intention?
Intention in our tradition, I can't speak for all the different ways this could be approached, but in our tradition, that's why we have a vow, so that you get into the vehicle, and then you may wake up, you may go to sleep, you may do whatever, but the power of the vow is really powerful. It's not just something you arbitrarily do. And you receive the vow, you actually observe the vow to be with all things. You take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha as your reference points, and then you receive the Bodhisattva vow, the vow to be with all things. And that's very, very personal. It takes maybe a lifetime to understand. Maybe you never really do understand what that was about. But it's more than just glue. I call it glue because it's just a way of finding a teaching that seems to work and say, I want to be part of this. It's not a club to join. There's no members. Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Anyone who's studying the concepts of the Buddha's teaching, the Noble Truths or the three marks or the three poisons or any of that, is basically practicing Buddhism for the length of time they're studying that or evaluating that or thinking about it. They're practicing that to some extent. And they're a Sangha. If someone else was there, then you'd have more and more people who are all doing that same thing. So, but I think if the intention is about, if you have an intention to just include sitting meditation like we do yoga, or like we would, and I think yoga is great, but like we do any kind of thing to study to work on our PhD or work on training to learn how to skydive or something like that. That's a certain kind of intention, but the vow actually starts to run when you're asleep. It just takes over. It's very irritating. Have you noticed? It's about the time. Then you realize why you did it, because if you hadn't done that, you'd be out of here. You'd be back on your mountain bike. Yes.
What is, when you say endeavor to observe, what does endeavor mean?
I don't know what the dictionary says, but it's like trying. You endeavor, insofar as you can, you get yourself to the cushion. If you're I'm very lazy, so it's very hard for me to get myself to do that. I didn't have, when the Sangha was not really strong, and my connection with my teacher was physically not very strong. So it's just hard. But you just do it anyway. You just keep doing it and keep returning it. That's why it says in the Zen vows that we take, Ravijayana Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, we say, I return to Buddha. Just keep returning. I return to the community of people who are trying to understand this because I need their support. Return to the truth that the Buddha taught. Everything is dependently arisen. Nothing comes from its own side as a separate self. And Ravijayana Buddha is an example of someone who is no longer crazy or not at war with anything, not objecting to anything, not agreeing with anything.
I don't remember what I read, but for the meditation instruction, but you say a lot, strengthen the awareness, not the thought process. And then you just mentioned earlier in the talk, ego mind, but sometimes you say strengthen your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference between the thought process and the mind?
Well, the mind, as I'm talking about it here, is just the spaciousness of consciousnness. So if you've been meditating very long, you can notice that there are times when there isn't much happening. It's just you're here, you're present, you know you're here, but nothing is particularly developing. Quite often this shows up early on for meditators as losing track of time or boredom. That's another way. Can't stand the open space, so we fill it up with thoughts of boredom. There isn't anyone to be bored. As long as there's boredom, then there's got to be, what do they call someone who's bored? A bored.
Boron.
A boron. A bored dad. I'd like to use that, but I won't remember it. Yes.
You say strengthen the mind sometimes. What is the mind?
From what I'm saying here is everything, the way I talk about this is to, and everyone has heard me say this, but just don't ignore your senses. Sense of touch, sense of taste, sense of smell, sense of hearing, sense of sound, sense of thinking for that matter. Just receive. And that's the generosity, is to give your attention to everything. It's an amazing situation to realize that all you have to do is just be with all things, as it says in the vow. Give your attention. Listen to the sky. I don't mean to get romantic, but listen to the birds, listen to traffic, listen to branches clicking together when it's really cold. Listen. And don't necessarily add anything to that. Don't make anything of it, unless you're a poet.
I get to add.
You get to do that. Yeah. branches. Go ahead.
What does receiving, turning on all the senses, being with all the senses, what is that attempting to do?
So the motivation there, the overall motivation is to deal with suffering, deal with aggression, passion, aggression, and ignorance. Those are the three poisons that establish and reify and keep constructing an artificial me who can win or lose, or self. And it is attached to this, the attachment to this body form that kind of supports that identity. And so what it's attempting to do is to help us over time to fuel less and less that kind of internal argument that's going on about I like it, I don't like it, it's good, it's bad, based on pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure, it's the same nerve endings that including in the mind, the same nerve endings that receive, as I sometimes say, the ice pick and the feather, same nerve endings. One feels good and one hurts. It's a similar, there's a dynamic there that's very, you have to see it yourself. It's not just some kind of philosophy we're talking about that you can believe in. But you could look at that, and the way you look at it, of course, is, sit down, hold still, and watch the way you disagree or agree with anything, and don't add anything to that. Don't add a confirmation. Like, don't add you have something happening, and then you have a comment on it. Like I was kind of picking on Gary a little bit. It's a very subtle area, and sometimes you won't see that unless you have someone point it out to you. And, but even that, it isn't like that I can affect some kind of a change. It's just that someone gives me permission to give me permission to give you some feedback. Then you'd have to present yourself to the person who's the teacher and open up a little bit so you can receive some help around how to train the mind. And it would be different with each person. Josh.
Can you separate from the mind?
It's too conceptual a situation to say that, because then we've got to define separation. We have to define. I would say yes and no. Doesn't help much, but that would be about as accurate as I can get.
Is there a mind without an ego?
To use the concept mind in the way it's often used in the teachings, I would say yes, it's just big mind. It's the consciousness that is the way it was taught by Suzuki Roshi and in other Zen traditions. Big mind, little mind. The little mind is a little petty mind that's always worried about this, judging this, and why does she have that thing in her hair like that? Because I told her to put it there. So a little petty kind of ideas, whereas a big mind is no longer picking and choosing, and it no longer has even a gender. It's just vast and without a self, without a solid core of identity happening, and it's the access to that comes through the Mahayana teachings of bodhicitta. So bodhicitta means bodhi means a Sanskrit word that means awake, and chitta means citta means mind. So awakened mind. So bodhicitta is the mind of someone who is moving towards that. The mind of the Buddha is there's no path left there. Whereas the bodhisattva, he, she, they are moving, you could say, out of their self-centeredness towards liberation. So big mind, little mind might be a good way of, yes.
So you said a few minutes ago, just now you said moving out of your position of
position.
Yeah.
Yes.
But then when you said to Joy that this is that I don't know what you were saying, awakening exactly, but you were saying that it's an occurrence and not an occurrence. Can you just say more?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good one. It's an occurrence in that something is happening, but it's a non-occurrence in that there's no one left to have the experience. So the actual occurrence is the dissolution of the part of the mind, they call it in the Yogacara tradition, called the seventh consciousness, which is self-love, self-pride, delusion of self, and just preoccupation with self-referential. Everything is about me. When that just collapses, there's still the five sense consciousnesses, the thinking process is still operating, but there's no solid being anymore. There's no solid identity. There's still a body, mind, but it doesn't belong to anyone. And that mind also looks around and sees that it's true of everyone, that everyone is in that same canoe. Everyone is there. They just don't know it. So then you think, well, that would be my way of doing it. Could I really get their attention? If I were to say something, would that be helpful to them, or should I just shut up and just have some more coffee? So it's an occurrence in that what's occurred is less. There just isn't much happening. So I'm not saying that you don't have some discursive thoughts come and go, like a few birds flying through the sky, but there's not much. And when something does happen that's big, or includes lots of other people, so there's lots of movement, like someone dealing with death, or someone you're either yourself or others being threatened by some catastrophe or something, of course there's going to be you're going to be flooded with all kinds of things, but it's not happening to a self anymore. So therefore, there's no fundamental terror about anything. And so this is why it's talked about in the Dzogchen tradition as a great perfection. If you realize it, you realize there's nothing to fix. It's very presumptuous to think that something needs to be fixed. You didn't create this. There's no little somebody somewhere who created this and make sure that the blood is flowing a certain way and the blood sugar is at a certain level. I really like saying that. So, thank you. Anything else? It's true and it's not true. It's occurrence and non-occurrence, and it's an occurrence in that there's some contrast there, but it's a non-occurrence in that there's nobody to claim it. There isn't anybody, but there's nobody, but there's nothing but this, and you're kind of a part of it, but you're not special anymore. Even though you might be in this situation where you're talking to people, or you're in a room where someone is going and saying, "This is happening, that's happening," not separate anymore. So therefore, it's and it can appear like arrogance, it can appear like humility, it can appear like indifference. To people who are busy projecting onto their world because they're not open enough to see that what's in front of them they're not separate from.
Is the daydreaming mind, can that still be big mind? Because you're not separate from it.
Yeah. Everything is big mind. It's just that sometimes we chisel out a little part of it to have our own little private session. More? This is big mind.
It seems to reinforce the point there's nowhere to get.
Yes. There's nothing to do. As I quoted this several times, Koben Jinaroshi's translation of the Heart Sutra's mantra is the Heart Sutra mantra is Gate Gate Paragate Parasangate Bodhisattva, or gone, completely awake, so be it. And his translation was falling apart, nothing to do. I think his translation is pretty accurate. So it doesn't mean there's nothing to do at all. It just means that there really isn't anything to do unless someone comes and asks you to do something. Or unless you better brush your teeth will fall out. You know about that? Looks like you're in pretty good shape with that area. I have 6 teeth. No, I have 7.
6 on top, 6 on the bottom.
6 in the top, 6 in the bottom. Good. I'm glad. Further questions? Yes.
One of the things I think you teach, if I say it correctly, is we practice sitting to find the truth for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But your talk title is Truth is Not a Fact.
No, it's not. Facts are relative things. A fact has something else that's its opposite. So those are the facts coming in. But the truth is not a fact. Because if it were a fact, then it would be separate from other things.
So how would we know if we found the truth?
You won't. There won't be any you left to know that. That's why it's so impossible to communicate this without talking in double speak. Basically, actually returning to the relative truth and just working with that as best as you can to lead people, help people use their awareness to see what is true for themselves. But each person has to do it, and each person has his or her own, what we call it, a burden or load of karma that they have to work with. And the first thing they have to, when I say have to, I don't know what they have to do, but it looks like we have to stop fighting with their own karma. You have to be who you are. Rinpoche, and the best two-word talk he ever gave was be genuine. And it took me a couple of decades to understand what that meant. Be genuine. Nothing to improve. There's nothing to change. There's nothing to train. But you have to train in order to see that. There's nothing trained. There's no trainer. Go ahead.
So how do you know if you're fighting with your karma or being genuine?
You'll know. If you're miserable, you're probably fighting. You're not miserable, so you're doing pretty good. More about that's a good question.
It just seems difficult to find that.
I can give you another thing that I can, and this is true probably for everybody. Maybe not for sure. There's going to be some situations where this may not apply. But if you continue, once you start this practice, and everyone in here has meditated some, maybe some of you quite a bit, if you keep getting drawn back into this, then you just need to keep getting drawn back into it. Continue to train your mind, and the way you will know is you no longer care whether you meditate or not. You no longer really have much of an interest in the teachings. I don't know how else to say it other than that. Other than by that time you may be in a position where people want your help because you understand something that they're trying to understand. So yes.
So have you transcended the teachings?
Well,
so when you say that you won't, I can't remember what you said, you won't care if you.
Yeah, I don't know how else to say it. It's difficult to say it without sounding strange or crazy, but it's like you don't have a mind anymore. You don't have a personal mind. And personal things can come and go. You can still have diabetes, you can still have a heart attack, you can still have all kinds of personal things happen, but you don't take them personally. You don't receive them as happening to you. It's happening, but it's not a problem that it's happening. Even intense pain is not a problem. It just hurts.
So if we're experiencing like some intense negativity or something, is it helpful to perhaps remind ourselves that we're living with our karma?
You could. One of the things that I sometimes say in your everyday life, if you can just flash on this now and then, everything is dependently arisen. Everything you see is not a separate object or thing. Our mind brings it down so that we can deal with it or use it or become materialistic or manipulate things. But fundamentally, everything is without a self. This is without a self. Everything else is without a self, and it is not separate. So therefore, it can be seen as you practice every day. You can continue to remind yourself that this you see the carpet that's dependent on everything else for its apparent singularity or separation or identity. That's one way to work with the mind. So you're not at war with the thinking process, but you're using the thinking process that's coming up to get that area of the mind to work with you. Work with your understanding, work with your awareness in a way that doesn't dismiss it. At some point, it'll dismiss itself. At some point, you won't. You'll just see it. You just see that nothing is separate. And it's not particularly mystical or magical. It's just the truth, which is not a fact.
Sometimes it feels like to say, well, that's your karma is a cop-out. For me, it just doesn't.
How often do I say that? Seriously, say that. Don't I say that?
I don't, once in a while, maybe.
So what's the question?
Guess I'm trying to look behind what it is that causes me to say, well, that's just a cop out because it's like you don't have anything else to say or something. It's. I guess I would liken it to the Christians who say, well, that's God's will. It just feels, I don't know, it feels shallow to me or something.
What's the question? Pardon me?
Maybe what is the shadow and what is it not?
Well, if you, karma is, if you go and look in the mirror, you're seeing karma. If you, as been said, I'm not the first one to say this, but I think it's a good way to express it or describe it. If you want to see your past life, look in the mirror, because that's where that came from. It came from the past. Mom and dad and just the past life, whatever, however you want to look at it, even if you don't want to go to the idea of past lives, but that's past. If you want to look at what's going to happen to you, look at the mind. See what's happening if the mind is spinning and discursive and at war and tugging and pulling, and either inside with oneself or outside by accusing others, people or situations, or one's karma, or one's, however you want to say it. Then that's where you're headed for. Machine.
Are you alive? No, this is weird.
Yeah.
Are you
Both.
alive?
Both.
Is
Alive and dead.
consciousness alive?
Both. It's alive. It's manifesting in a living form. So there's what is the word? Contiguous. Is that a word? Yeah. It's together, but if the body just collapses, and consciousness doesn't go anywhere. The spirit doesn't.
Consciousness exists in space that isn't alive.
Again, please.
Does consciousness exist in places that aren't alive?
It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's not a fact. So it's not only something that comes into existence can pass out. A way you can get a little taste of this, and I do this all the time, but I think it's a good one, is to say, if I say something like something, especially something that doesn't exist, like a blue tomato. You see your mind inside. Does everybody see that blue tomato? Are there leaves on the top of it or not? No leaves. Okay. Huh?
Now there are.
Now there are. Well, that's a good thing because that exists. It non-exists. So it exists. It's something that's so common that we just you could say take that for granted. But that's an area of the consciousness that is incredible. There's no time. There's no space. It doesn't exist in a space. It doesn't exist 20 years from now. If that tomato is going to be right there. It'd be wherever that. So the spatial situation is a deeper dimension. And so when the body mind drops, then that dimension starts to show up more strongly as not having a past and future. Yes.
Is karma then a part of consciousness?
But just like the body participates in that, you have all kinds of consciousness that's happening. You have karmic cause and effect that's happening. So you talk about past lives, which seems to show up that way. I'm not here to promote past lives necessarily. That's just a way of talking about consciousness that has some kind of continuity to it. Go ahead. Did I get it right?
Yes.
What were you thinking about? Yeah, that's fine. Any other questions? Questions are really, really good. I really like questions a lot because I don't know much. Go ahead.
You say endeavor not to add, subtract, or ignore,
Yeah.
but you talked about being genuine, which
Yes.
seems like adding, subtracting, ignoring. So how can you endeavor not to add and receive yourself at the same time?
And receive what?
And receive the adding, subtracting, or be genuine.
People know.
Hmm?
You know how to do that. Just don't stop objecting to anything. And if there's objecting going on to that, don't object to that. That's where we get in trouble. It's the double negativity. The first negativity is just raw negativity. Like sometimes we project onto others, well, if you've been meditating for 20, 30 years, then you can't lose your temper because you're a meditator. So you need to go meditate more. But actually, it opens that whole dimension up so that passion, aggression, ignorance can operate freely. You still have passion. You might have great passion about art, about your love life, with no demand. Because you're totally ready to receive anything and enjoy it. But if it's somebody comes and takes it away, it's just gone. You don't blame someone for taking it, and you don't track them down to take it back. Doesn't mean you don't lock your house. Of course you do. So you're practical about it. But on the other hand, no demand on things need to be this way and not that way. That's where it seems to get difficult. And for the mind to start to show up with that kind of spaciousness is the way it looks here. I don't know. It looks like realization to me. But there isn't anything else but that. So therefore, you're so clear. To say it this way, you're so clear and you're so done with all the warfare and you're so collapsed, falling apart. The ego mind, the structure, the demand is all falling apart. It seemed to be unreal. Hasn't been destroyed. It's been seen through because you're intensely, over a period of time, training the mind to see what is true. And you have to look at a whole lot of things that are false first before you eventually see that's false. There is no solid self in the skandhas: form, feeling, perception, concept, consciousness. Form, there's no self there. Feeling, there's no self there. What's the next one? Perception. There's no self in the perception. There's just perception.
No
consciousness, the sixth sense feels in their objects. No, there's no solid self there. They get together and look like somebody. You get to part your hair on this side instead of that side. You get to kind of express some kind of individuality. And depending on the causes and conditions, the karma, the countless numbers of lifetimes that have been lived, living and dying and living and dying and living and dying. Here we are again. Here you are again. You may not have any memory of past lives, but you don't need to have a memory of a past life. I don't have any memory of past lives, and I work with it all the time. Well, except for that one where I got my head chopped off. That's kind of vivid.
Random.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm just joking. I don't remember that. Pardon me?
Probably would have if you said that.
Yeah, I should have kept my head. I didn't though. Further questions? We're getting close to time to eat, so probably have another question. Back up. Well, don't ask me that. You have anything?
It's like I have many, but I don't have this one right here.
It's okay. Rasheen? Ann? So, somebody's got a question. Yes.
How do you see the demands that you can't see?
Pardon me?
How do you said passion without aggression, ignorance without demands. How do you see a demand?
You realize that you have a desire or a passion or something is happening like that, and you don't get your way, and you notice that you don't demand it. It's like, I don't know. It's like an example. Yes, sir.
Is that not attaching to fulfillment?
Yeah, it's not attaching to fulfillment. You don't It's not that you don't desire things, but there's desire still arises, but it just arises without a self, without any, and the self is the part of the consciousness that demands something, that wants something to come into that sense consciousness, either into the taste buds. You want lemon meringue pie, someone takes away from you, or they don't make the lemon meringue pie. And they do better than you avoid doing that. So it's just there's more give and take. There's more playful. Playful would be a good. There's more playfulness about it. Not that you're being silly particularly, but just more. It's just interesting the way you want something and then it goes and you notice that you're not concerned with that. What are you concerned with? Be with all things. You actually enjoy losing. You enjoy gaining. It's called, in the Buddhist tradition, we have to be careful of this because people ascribe some kind of different meaning to it that it's actually bliss. And this has been, I'm not the one I'm just saying something that's been taught down through the centuries, that beings who have practiced this have noticed something about this. It arises that way. But it doesn't, you don't get rid of your ego. You don't have to get rid of something that's not real. The ego is absolutely just a mask, just a string puppet. So it may come around, it may not. And if it does, fine. If it leaves, fine, yes.
If you feel really happy, is there something to be suspicious of?
Do you feel happy?
A lot of the time,
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah.
You should enjoy it. There's no suspicion. Just notice that, you just notice the polarity and notice that the one, and this is the way of saying it. This isn't something you have to practice from now on, but you'll notice that the one, if there's an ego, the one who's experiencing happiness and the one who's experiencing loss or sadness it's the same consciousness. So that consciousness, once it's realized, that doesn't change. And it's unchanging in the sense that it doesn't have something else it can contrast with. So just enjoy, you could say enjoy or see or experience the way your emotions get really, really intense. And then we tend to kind of buy into that on some level. And then they completely turn and go the other way. And then we're feeling, and then we'll look for causes. So yes, you should just enjoy it if you're happy.
Or clap your hands.
Yeah. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Is that it? If you're happy, yeah. If you're happy and you know it, is that it? So it's.
If you're happy and you are aware.
All right. Well, we got a new. That would be a new kind of mantra. Yeah, Saga theme song. If you're happy and you know, clap your hands. If you're happy and you show it, clap your hands. Thank you, Joy.
Keep going.
If you don't
know it,
and
your
you
face will really
show it.
If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
All right. Glad we caught that. Now there's a Dharma talk for you. So that's another thing before we tune out here and change stations or go to commercial break. It's not about not adding. It's about noticing that, just noticing the adding, and then if it needs to, in regard to the whole complicated matrix, however you want to say that, if it needs to drop away, it'll drop away. If it needs to stay in there for a while, it'll stay. There's a saying or a slogan in the Tibetan tradition that goes back a long, long time that says, "Better for me to live, let me live. Better for me to die, let me die." Complete, you could say, a verbal, conceptual expression of just being with whatever rises. Everyone here is going to die. To relate to that in a way that that doesn't make it something that shouldn't happen. Rather than something is just something. It's not something that should happen. It's just something that's happening. Further questions before we close? Good, thank you.
Thank you.